Good afternoon, my friends. This is the Grim Flayer. I hope you're doing very well today. If you're not doing that well today, and you're a black-based mid-range player, I can guarantee that you'll be doing a whole lot better after having watched this video, because Dauthi Voidwalker is one of the very best cards in Modern Horizons 2, period, and probably the best card that we've gotten for our broad archetype, and I think other archetypes can say the same thing, so we're going to break it all down for you. Thank you so much to this wonderful community for your hype, for your support, for watching, and for everything else that you guys do, your great ideas. It goes on and on and on, but Dauthi Voidwalker is completely off the chain. We're going to talk all about it, and let's start by reading it. Dauthi Voidwalker is a Dauthi rogue, and when we saw this creature type, this type line hinted at by Maro, I got excited. I was like, man, I can't wait to see that Dauthi rogue. Now, little did I know just how good it would turn out to be. But Dauthi Voidwalker, the Dauthi rogue, is a 2-mana value, black, 3/2. And when you see a huge wall of text, and then you see something that's a 3/2 for 2, you're like, okay, the body seems pretty decent as long as that text is relevant. And it is, because the first line of text reads Shadow. This creature can block or be blocked by only creatures with Shadow. Now, I don't know about y'all, but the last time I saw a Shadow threat in Modern was never, right? I looked at quickly, took a quick perusal of the Modern Legal Shadow threats. Nether Trader appears to be the broadly strongest one of them. Even the mighty Nether Trader, though, can do nothing before Dauthi Voidwalker except offer a chump block. Voidwalker truly is the crown prince of all Shadow threats in Modern. That is undeniable, but let's read on. So the second line of text: if a card would be put into an opponent's graveyard from anywhere, instead exile it with a void counter on it. Now let's forget about the void counter for a moment. Does the rest of that line remind you of anything, my friends? Well, it should. We're talking about the ley line of the void effect. It's one-sided static graveyard hate, where if a card would be put into an opponent's graveyard from anywhere, you exile it instead. So even before we talk about the void counter and the third line of text, what we have here is a pseudo-unblockable, virtually unblockable, 3/2 for 2 that has a ley line of the void static ability, or replacement effect, I guess. That is absolutely insane. Now, Leyline of the Void is very powerful. I have warned against it most of the time in most metagames for midrange, and I've said this before and I'll say it again. Static hate pieces have to really be the very best option for us in order for me personally to advise playing them. If it's a really warped metagame, go for it. If it does something that no other cards can do, go for it. But the classic example is Collector Roof is a far better midrange card than Stony Silence, because Collector Roof is a 2/2, and that can turn sideways, and it's not strictly better because it dies to more things, but overall, we need our hate pieces to be multifunctional. If they're not trading with the opponent, like actively trading and are drawing a card like Nile Spellbomb kind of does, if it's just a static hate piece, we need it to turn sideways if we can. Dauthi Voidwalker does that. Now, if it didn't say void counter, and if there wasn't this final paragraph of text on here, this would be a good card. 3/2 for 2, Shadow, Leyline of the Void, seems really, really good, but there's more. So remember, it says exile it with a void counter on it. Let's just humor the designers and see if that comes up in the final paragraph here, shall we? Okay, so the final ability is tap and sacrifice Dauthi Voidwalker as the cost. The ability is choose an exiled card an opponent owns with a void counter on it. You may play it this turn without paying its mana cost. Maybe you didn't hear me. I'll say that again. You may play it this turn without paying its mana cost. Oh my god. This card is nuts. This card is completely insane. So what does that look like? What's an example? Well, okay, let's say you're against Tron. Maybe you disrupt them with a turn 1 Inquisition, whatever. And then we go turn 2 Dauthi Voidwalker. And then the Tron player does more setup things. Maybe they had played map T1 and cracked it on T2 or whatever. And then it's turn 3, and you go land, Thought sees you, and what do we see but a good old Ulamog the Ceaseless Hunger? We'll take the Ulamog. Ulamog is exiled with a void counter on it, and then we'll tap and sack Dauthi Voidwalker, and then let's play Ulamog this turn without paying its mana cost, or Karn Liberated, or literally any Tron payoff. You take your pick. Thank you, Tron player. Very cool. So clearly, we're talking about a very, very high, close to Christmas land scenario, but honestly, it's really not that far fetched. And honestly, even less impressive scenarios still are very, very good with Voidwalker. Again, those first two abilities are very nice, and then the final ability allows you, with perfect information, at basically any point you choose, to decide to upgrade your Shadow 3/2 Leyline of the Void threat into some card from the opponent, whatever it might be. And it is a card that you may have already dealt with in some way, shape, or form, because looking back to the second line, if a card would be put into an opponent's graveyard from anywhere, so that means if it's a targeted discard effect, if it's non-targeted discard, if you have removed it, if you are milling them somehow, like with a Thought Scour, no matter how you're putting it into the graveyard, if Dauthi Voidwalker is on the field, it's exiled, which might hose them, and it's got a void counter on it, which means you can turn your Voidwalker into it if you want. So that is just absolutely insane. And that's what the card does, and that's all the different things that it does. And those are the efficient above rate ways in which it does those things. But there's a lot more to talk about, guys. So next we're going to kind of segue into just a couple kind of curiosities, things to know. Right? Some strategic concerns or some rules concerns. The first one I want to mention is this. If damaged base removal kills Dauthi Voidwalker, so your lightning bolts, your stomps, whatever, then those cards that were used to kill it will be exiled with void counters on them. It has to do with how damage is assigned, basically, whereas if you use a hard kill spell like Fatal Push or Abrupt Decay, those things will not be exiled, and it's, I'm oversimplifying here, but basically the damage resolves, the spell resolves, and then the Dauthi Voidwalker, before anyone receives priority, dies to state-based effects. But before the game checks for those state-based effects, the replacement effect of Dauthi Voidwalker's ability means that the lightning bolt or what have you will be exiled. I don't know if I explained that perfectly, but the important thing to know is that if they bolt your Voidwalker, the bolt is exiled with a void counter, and if they push your Voidwalker, it just goes to the graveyard, kind of like anything else. Another interesting kind of strategic thing is that some decks, whether it be with individually powerful answer cards like Lightning Axe or with their broad strategy overall, they get an overpowered effect because the effect is designed to have you 1-for-2 yourself to play it, such as a 1-mana instant speed deal 5 in the color red, like this Lightning Axe here. But with Dauthi Voidwalker's Leyline of the Void style effect, the card that they discard to fuel the Lightning Axe, and therefore to fuel their graveyard-based strategy, is actually just going to get exiled, so you are absolutely hosing those cards. Even some of the ways to maybe try to deal with Dauthi Voidbringer are not going to be profitable for the opponent. It is going to be a true 1-for-2 that they inflict upon themselves, in addition to whatever other damage the Dauthi Voidwalker has done to them, both literally and figuratively. The final thing I want to say in this section is you consider cards like Past in Flames or Snapcaster Mage, right? So Past in Flames is representative, of course this goes into Storm, but it's representative of other types of decks like that, where they basically build up ahead of steam and they use the graveyard as another resource. And in order to do what they want to do on a consistent basis, on a value positive basis, they'll end up dipping into the graveyard at some point. With Dauthi Voidwalker rather, on the field, that's not really possible. They can't get enough cards in there to fuel a good Past in Flames, and they can't even flash back the Past in Flames itself until the Voidbringer has been answered. I keep saying Voidbringer now. It's Voidwalker. Until the Voidwalker has been answered. And kind of the other end of the spectrum, but similar energy, is represented here by Snapcaster Mage, but this could also be, like Logic Knot or Kroxa Titan of Deathhunger. So pilots with those cards in their deck will often be happy to make plays that are, nominally spinning their wheels, right? Like just an opt for whatever reason, or just like making an okay trade because they know it is serving a greater purpose, right? They know that they can maybe snap it back later with Snapcaster Mage, or they're adding fuel for Delve for Logic Knot or Escape for Kroxa. Those things are all also incidentally hosed by Dauthi Voidwalker, even if your opponent doesn't care about this card to the point where they have to remove it or die, this is still definitely a lot of value for, again, a 3/2 shadow for 2 that can upgrade itself into whatever the situation calls for, as long as your opponent is kind enough to provide it. Alright friends, so for the final section of this video, I'd like to make a pros and cons list in terms of cards that jump out to me as either slightly non-bowy or very synergistic with Dauthi Voidwalker. So in the interest of ending on a high note, let's begin with the cons. Sadly, we do have some non-bowing here with Tarmogoyf, because if you've got a main deck Leyline of the Void style effect, your Goyfs are just going to be a lot smaller. Also, if you've got a main deck shadow threat with decent power, your need for the Clock of Goyf is going to be a little bit less. And finally, they're just competing on that 2-drop slot, right? So it's not that they're totally unplayable together, it's that Tarmogoyf does not specifically synergize with Dauthi Voidwalker in really overt ways, although depending on what you find with the Voidwalker, of course, that could make up for some of the downfalls that I just mentioned. Another card that doesn't really thrive directly alongside Dauthi Voidwalker is Scavenging Ooze, and that is simply because the Leyline of the Void fills the role that Skooz is there to do, and if you are in control and you're killing everything that moves and you're against creatures, in fact, it's kind of taking away food from Skooz that could otherwise grow it and stabilize it, so some unwelcome overlap here. Now, if you're in a really warped meta where you need what Dauthi Voidwalker does, you also need what Scavenging Ooze does, fair enough, but ultimately, Skooz is a card that's been getting squeezed out of BGX outside of maybe the Rock at a pretty steady rate over the last year or so. I expected Dauthi Voidwalker to accelerate that process a little bit, sad but true. Another card that I'm not sad about non-bowing with Dauthi Voidwalker is Path to Exile. I've kind of always been against Path to Exile in Dead Guy or in Abzan. Sometimes you reach for a copy or two. Sometimes my donor wants to play them for a donation league, so I play them, but ultimately it's not a good mid-range card alongside black-based mid-range decks in a vacuum, because we are a resource depletion deck, and we are giving them a resource in a very powerful way with Path to Exile, and basically no matter what, you'll be giving them one. Unlike Assassin's Trophy, where sometimes it is a true one-for-one, you know, you're downgrading a land, you don't give them an extra card. With Path, you're always giving them an extra card. And of course, Path exiling things is no big deal with Dauthi Voidwalker also exiling things, so we don't need Path as much alongside Dauthi if it's a black-white X deck, and that is a good thing. That also, though, applies to the new white elemental incarnation, Solitude, because of course Solitude is Swords to Plowshares, you're exiling things. That's just some overlap that might not be the very best with Dauthi Voidwalker. In addition, Voidwalker is black and requires black-black on turn 2, making it that much less likely that you can have a coherent shell that also enables Solitude with a critical mass of white cards early to evoke with, right? So these are cards that are not necessarily all working well together. The next card I'll talk about is kind of a segue between the cons into the pros, and that's Liliana of the Veil. She has a foot in both camps, because the con with Liliana and Dauthi Voidwalker is that you want all of your creatures to be able to protect the queen, to plant themselves in front of Liliana and say, Liliana's my key to victory here. I'm going to throw myself under the bus to protect her, and I'm going to offer a block. Dauthi Voidwalker not doing that, except basically against other Dauthi Voidwalkers. That said, the pros definitely outweigh the cons here as far as I can tell, because Liliana's +1 and her -2 and her -6 are all very good options for us already, obviously, but they all work with Dauthi Voidwalker. You are able to deplete the opponent, not worry about them getting resources out of their graveyard, and as always, you can transform basically the Voidwalker into whatever else you want. Now for some cards, my friends, that are extra nice alongside Dauthi Voidwalker, all of which are already great cards for us in the first place. Fatal Push, and this represents any form of removal, basically. Classically, BG the Rock and Jund. These decks lack exile effects. Well, now you can build your own exile effects without any downsides with a Fatal Push or whatever else, plus Dauthi Voidwalker, and as always, it's giving more fuel for the Voidwalker to decide to upgrade itself into whatever the case calls for. That, of course, applies to targeted discard effects too. I'm using Thoughtseize as the representative here because it is the most impactful one, simply because we do have the highest range of takes that are very desirable to transform Dauthi into off of a Thoughtseize. We talked about some Tron payoffs. Those are great examples. But of course, it is worth mentioning that Dauthi Voidwalker once again can't block, so maybe your life loss from Thoughtseize could be that little bit more crippling, giving Inquisition an edge in a different way. Either way, both discard spells are wonderful companions with the Voidwalker. And speaking of discard effects, how about Grief? Unlike Solitude, Grief is a slam dunk fit alongside Dauthi. Grief enables Dauthi. Dauthi protects us from the opponent getting removal off of Grief's depletion. They are both black cards, so if you have excess Dauthis, you can pitch to Grief if need be. The whole thing is just completely incredible altogether. And the next thing to talk about is Kroxa, Titan of Death's Hunger. The Voidwalker is good against Kroxa, but it is also good with Kroxa. Kroxa's got that discard effect that, as we have just explained 100 times over, synergizes really, really well here, and Kroxa obviously getting very good mileage just on its own as a finisher in the face of all this depletion. As if that wasn't enough, when Dauthi sacrifices itself to use that activated ability, that's just another card in the bin for good old Kroxa. How about Stoneforge Mystic too? Stoneforge Mystic is a card that allows us to play on a totally different axis from anything that we've been talking about here. And Stoneforge Mystic going to tutor up your weapon of choice. Why don't we go ahead and slap that on Dauthi Voidwalker? It's got Shadow after all. I don't think the opponent is blocking your Dauthi Voidwalker dual-wielding Fire and Ice and Feast and Famine anytime soon. That would be absolutely insane. We gotta mention Lurrus here, guys. Lurrus is an incredible engine, an incredible top end in so many different decks. I think there is no reason it wouldn't be great alongside Voidwalker. If they remove your Voidwalker, you can buy it back. Even better, if you sacrifice Voidwalker after hosing them in multiple different ways to do something completely busted, you can then also just buy it back with Lurrus at some point in the mid to late game. How about that? Now, for my final piece of spice, this is maybe the most exciting discovery I've made in like the half an hour I've had to think about this and to look into it before I decided to record this video. Malakir Rebirth. Those of you who have been following my brew with Griefblade know that this is kind of ephemerate number 5 through 7 in the list, because it is Malakir Mire as a double MDFC. It can be a land drop if you need it. That is fantastic. Structurally, and deck building, you get to have your cake and eat it too. I'm on 24 lands, with 3 of them being Malakir Mires, despite being a relatively low curve mid-range deck, so we've got a very high, very safe land count. If we need these for land drops, that's what they are, even if they're kind of bad. But really the idea here is that Malakir Rebirth is ephemerate number 5 through 7, especially for Grief, but also in the face of like opponent's removal, it's kind of like a worse ephemerate. But what it does alongside Dauthi Voidwalker is, of course, completely incredible, because you get to tap and sack Dauthi Voidwalker to use that activated ability. But first, Malakir Rebirth resolves. You do lose 2 life, whatever. Maybe we'll play Death Shadow 2 to take advantage of that, why not? But until end of turn, that creature gains. When this creature dies, return it to the battlefield tapped under its owner's control. So that's right, you get to turn Dauthi Voidwalker into a brand new card, and then bring back Voidwalker to continue shadow attacks, to continue hating out their graveyard, and you did it all off of a card that could also be deployed as a land. Get your copies now, my friends, of Malakir Rebirth. So those are my thoughts on Dauthi Voidwalker. This card is absolutely insane. It will jund, it will rock, it is dead, and it's probably good in Shadow, and it's probably good in 8-rack, and it's probably good anywhere else you want to play it, as long as you are interacting with the opponent in a black-based way, which is pretty much a given with a BB 2-mana value card called Dauthi Voidwalker, thank you so much for watching. Of course, I want to know what you think. Leave that below. And I don't know if we're going to see a spoiler to top this one, but there's still a little ways to go. Maybe, just maybe, we will. Until then, this is arguably the most hype I have felt thus far from a set that has me hyped to the moon. I hope you feel the same. I hope you're excited as well. And yeah, let me know what you're thinking below. I'll see you there.